And there we go. I believe that I'm live for a half-hour late rail natter. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Oh my goodness, you're all here. People are asking if I use tea bags. Yes, I do. In most instances, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I use loose leaf. Mostly, I use tea bags. I have a nice. In fact, let's immediately go big face. Where I can grovelingly apologise to you. Having a nice, appropriately mugged regional railways cup of Assam in the moment. Very nice. Marvellous. Welcome. It's the first solo episode of 20... Oh, crikey, the colour. I've got different LEDs that haven't quite worked properly that I need to fix. I'm still looking very jaundiced and green. Anyway, let's get on with it, shall we? It's episode 148 of Rail Natter. It's the first solo episode of 2023. We're very nearly at 150 episodes, so golly to that. Tonight we are talking about every asterisk way that the Railways Act 1993 has resulted in today's mess. So this is going to be a brief history. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll talk more about what this episode is going to do later, but suffice to say, this is going to be the first in a few different episodes unpicking this, the calamity that was the Railways Act 1993. A few different episodes picking it up. Hopefully we'll get some guests in to talk to give some different perspectives, but I'm going to give mine tonight. And hopefully it will be interesting. It's not going to be a detailed history, but it's going to pick up the interesting stuff that that explains how everything fits together and results in the mess we have today, because there are direct threads that lead right through to it. And this is going to be an episode where I have a rare situation where I'm reading off... Well, okay, I'm trying to get ahead of myself. No. Let's get on with it. Everyone who is in here, in the chat... all of you here, hello to everyone. Welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. Yeah, well, there we go. That was the Intercity 225 fading away. This evening, everyone. This is so this Rail Natter is based essentially off a piece that's currently being published through the IPPR's journal Progressive Review, where I have kind of summarised the kind of a summarised history of the privatised railway, because we're kind of reaching... Well, the it won't die, but we have reached the end of this chapter in the history of our railways. It's just that the end is we've only reached the beginning of the end, not the end of the end. Hello, Detour. Hello, everyone in the chat. If you want to, if you're an academic and you have access to the piece, I can pop a link in the description. You can go and have a read of it, I think. But if you're not, it's not an open access one. I need to work out exactly to what extent Wiley will get upset if I post a longer version of the article, about 800 words longer, on Medium. But because it's through Wiley, and any academics in here, Deirdre is one, I know is here, any academics here will know the extent to which the academic bloody things and Wiley are a bit nasty when it comes to them being shifty and blocking papers from being published. So to the point where they might get angry at the IPPR if I publish mine. Anyway, whatever. I'll get over that and provide a source of pirating it in some easy way soon. / making a link to the PDF. Anyway, so this is what we're going to be basing it on. This story, this tale is going to be weaved through. I pulled this together, and I didn't when I started writing this. Let's make my little face appear in the top corner. Hello, here I am. When I started writing this, I didn't expect it to stitch together as neatly into the narrative of, oh yeah, this is why everything's screwed up, as it did. So yes, we will press on, and I'm going to try and keep this to an hour, because I've already taken up half an hour of your time by being late. So let us crack on. Hello to everyone listening in audio-only format, by the way. This should work quite well in audio-only format, frankly. So we begin before the Railways Act 1993, because it's worth surveying the terrain a little bit. What was going on? What was going on in the background? What was going on in the railways in 1990? Well, And indeed, what's the kind of context for this? Why is it important for us to kind of think back on that on the Railways Act 1993? Well, because of the mess that everything is in. So that mess that everything is in, which I kind of highlighted in my piece, that mess that everything is in. Well, Britain's railways are kind of arguably at their lowest ebb since the early 1960s. You could pretty much frame it that way. And we've got more trains being cancelled than any time in the industry's recent history. We have. We've got more the timetables of key operators kind of providing a third fewer services, in some cases even worse than that, half the services than pre-COVID. Things are worse now than at the time of the May 2018 timetable meltdown. And it's worth remembering, and I'll repoint this out later, nothing has changed since the May 2018 timetable. Not a single thing. No new stuff, no changes have been made that were recommended off the back of May 2018. So, but a key point is that this isn't solely a calamity of this current government's doing, or even the kind of previous iterations of it. And so to understand kind of why things have got so bad, why there's so much industrial action, why the timetables are a mess, we kind of have to understand how the current industry has developed, where it came from, and that kind of dates back before the Railways Act kind of completely disintegrated BR. So let's jump back to 1990, and things are actually, we had British Rail. Things were actually looking pretty good for Britain's railways. Ridership had been climbing pretty solidly since. In fact, I've got graphs. I've got graphs that are in a different order to the ones that I've put on here. Let me just whiz in here. Oh, actually, yeah. When I say British Rail, I actually don't just mean British Rail, because really the railways were operating as bits already. It was unified, but you had, in terms of the passenger railway, you had three very strong brands. One of them's on my mug. Here it is in the top corner. You had Intercity, of course, Swallow, wonderful. Network South East, toothpaste, very popular. Regional railways, less popular, but actually very good. This isn't the way I would have sectorised British Rail, by the way, but this was the way it was done, and it was very, very successful, frankly. It was very good. And at the bottom, my little dots and bits, apart from Freightliner, because Freightliner's original BR logo is quite hard to locate. But anyway, I could have remade it, but anyway. All the freight sectors, of which there were 5 or 6, no, 7 actually. There were 7. If you count the fact that rail freight distribution, no, not rail freight. The one of them was split into 4. The 3. The rail freight was a little bit complicated under BR, but it worked pretty well. Fine. No, the slides are in the right order. I just forgot the order I was putting them in. So BR in kind of this form. So, but these were all interconnected. There were government was increasingly trying to create commercial boundaries between them, and to some extent there were some challenges in the relationship between the three passenger organisations and freight. You could argue that it was over prioritising the passenger railway over the freight railway, but it was very much still BR. So, the ridership had been climbing. Let's get the old whack-em out. Because I want to scribble on things. The ridership had been climbing pretty solidly since the mid-80s. There you are. You can see up to this point, kind of climbing up to 1990. There'd been a bit of a dip, but it wasn't bad. Ridership was very much on the up and up. And in terms of subsidies, people talk about BR as being inefficient. Those people are simply lying, or they are horribly misinformed. Because British Rail was, the average subsidy was as low, kind of in the late 80s. Subsidy was as low as 20% of running costs. Now you might go, well, it spiked. Well, it spiked in the same way that it spiked during COVID, because ridership dropped because there was a big recession. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, subsidy was as low as 20% of running costs, which made BR one of, if not the most efficient system in Europe, railway system in Europe, like genuinely as a phrase we all hate, world beating. We had a pretty good railway system. There are other things going on. So Thameslink, and this will all sound familiar, folks, to you. Thameslink had just been opened. It's providing the first high-capacity suburban rail link through London, and crossrail planning was kind of fairly well advanced. You had you kind of got plans for new high-speed rail links between the Channel Tunnel, under King's Cross, and then out towards the north of England. and beyond. So there are plans for a high-speed rail network and kind of massive improvements in journey times into Europe. And you had the Trans-Pennine route upgrade was being developed. So electrification across the Pennines. All of this sounding somewhat familiar. Am I right? Yes. Anyway, so this was fine. Then, by the way, if you want an update of kind of how optimistic things were looking in 1990, then I strongly recommend that you Google Future Rail the Next Decade. It's on the Railways Archive. It's an interesting little document to read through. I sadly don't have a copy of it. I've got the kind of the equivalent version of it from 1980 or from 1979, which is behind me down here. But this is well worth a read. So 1991, and bad things happened, and I don't just mean a miniaturized me appearing in 1991. No, actual bad things happened. What happens if your entire economy is run by people who are out of their mind on coke? The answer is you get regular recessions. Hooray! And indeed, we had an enormous recession at the end of the 1980s into the early 1990s. And as a result of this, unlike kind of the more recent recession, where we'd had a decade of things of public services kind of being restitched back together a bit. Maybe not as much as, not as much in the way that we'd like, but undeniably public services were being invested in through the new Labour years. Racism was also being invested in, but that's another story. But through the 1980s, not so much the case. And in fact, we'd basically been borrowing our way into economic prosperity by selling everything. We'd been selling all the family heirlooms. And actually, if you see what happened, so you can see through the 1980s where this nominal GDP growth is just from us selling things and discovering oil. But ridership was rising. So, the daily rail distance travelled per capita, so the amount that people were individually travelling by train, kind of on average, was increasing. Then we got a pretty deep recession, and ridership started dropping again. So ridership had been climbing. In fairness, it had been climbing. It'd been climbing from 1970 onwards. So BR, even in the late 60s, BR kind of turning things around. Then another recession. Then it climbed again. Then another recession, and it dropped again. And in fact, at the end of the 80s, the oil crisis and the 1979 recession hit ridership again. But then again, one from the mid-80s onwards, it was climbing. There's a bigger world out there than just the railways in the south. You've got to look at what's happening in the bigger picture of people travelling around and going to work to understand ridership patterns. But yeah, from the mid-80s onwards, even from the early 80s, it was very much climbing. Not early 90s recession or late 89, 90 recession hit that hard, and ridership dropped, and more than a decade of kind of constrained public spending meant that impact on passenger numbers did make the subsidy jump upwards. And as we saw with COVID, government panicked, and the doctrine that had held pretty rigidly of everything but the railways was thrown out of the window, and plans for privatisation were kind of put into motion. This is bad, folks. So, what next? Well, bad news. July 1992, worse things were happening, for our railways at least, which is that a white paper called New Opportunities for the Railways was published. Now, you might be wondering, who authored this document? The answer is maybe not the sort of answer you'd like, because the main authors of this report were the Adam Smith Institute of 55 Tufton Street. They're nasty right-wing libertarian maniacs. And they were the ones who essentially described the structure that the railways would be or the meat grinder that the railways would be churned through to create the new structure. So, this is kind of like these two. Also, this is Treasury. There's lovely Treasury. These two are the authors of that white paper, and it recommended little less than I would call it an atomization of the formally integrated railway operating structure, with the creation, in their mind, the creation of as many independent elements as possible to maximise the perceived opportunities for competition. So, if you follow the loopy logic of neoliberal libertarian maniacs or vampires, depending on how you want to describe them, people who just don't have not even your best interest, they don't have your interests at heart in any way whatsoever. they see that the smaller the pieces, the more competition, the more that you will have an efficient marketized system. Bad news. It doesn't work. As we've seen relentlessly, in practice, it don't work. Actually, briefly, and this is a bonus thing for you lot, over if you just read the piece. There's a little letter here from that was written to Margaret Thatcher in 1985 about privatising water, and it's quite interesting. So here's the little note on top of the thing, and then underneath it is a little sort of typed out letter that I think is interesting to it's interesting to pick out, because it picks out what the logic behind privatisation was. All of the privatisation, very few, if not all of the privatisations through the 1980s were bad. They were bad news. They weren't a very good idea. Things that are actually fundamental to, take the example of British Telecoms, BT, a good example of a thing that should be part of the functioning of the state, because internet, as we now know, is a critical part of us functioning. It's as critical to us being able to live our lives as water and electricity, which both were also privatised and should not have been, both of which we've also shown should absolutely be within the public sector and managed as a state entity, because they are vital things for us to live. And the idea that there is real competition is simply for the birds. So, there's some good things that we can look at. I can't point to this because it's on a PDF, not on the old PowerPoint. But the bottom sort of paragraph there is saying, water is a good candidate for privatisation because many, though not all, of the water authorities are already in good shape for private ownership, do not need a long period of elaborate restructuring. This is the perception for the railways, because the sectorisation had sort of taken BR down a bit of a kind of a corporate structure point. Uncritical Simon's pointing out that ASI are on Great Smith Street, one road away from Tufton Street. They moved. They've always been part of the Tufton Street cabal. They're the same. They're funded the same way. They're the same organisational structure as the Taxpayers Alliance and others. The water authorities between them own substantial assets and employ more than 50,000 people, so they will make a big contribution to the privatisation programme. It's a good example of it has lots of people, which means it'll make the number of public sector workers reduce, which was seen just simply ideologically as a good thing. The water authorities say they need to invest in renewing their assets faster than Treasury constraints permit. Yes, the obvious thing there is, well, loosen those Treasury constraints, but no, that, not according to Treasury brain. Privatisation would free them from the constraints and allow them to borrow from the private market at higher rates, which they would then charge back to the public sector, back to the taxpayer. It's amazing how much this logic is never followed through. Remarkable stuff. We have Lynn Baxter on here. Hello, Lynn. It's an honour to have you on, given your knowledge and understanding of this. I hope I do the subject justice. We would not be selling off a national monopoly like BT because the performance of each of the 10 water authorities can be measured against that of the others, introducing an element of competition. Again, just like water companies, where I have no choice what water company I choose. Competition is fake. Competition is only therefore created by having a regulator that's got teeth. And if you have a regulator that's got teeth, the reality is that there won't really be any competition. They'll just be delivering to the lowest common denominator against the contracts delivered by that or delivered by the contracting authority and managed by the regulator. Sounds familiar. Oh yeah, that's right. Railways also. The general advantages of this is a fun one. The general advantages of privatisation, such as wider share ownership by the public and employees. Why is that an advantage? Removal of state interference. What does that mean? And realisation of assets apply with full force. So all of that's ideological gibberish that doesn't mean anything. All of this stuff, all that stuff, very familiar to us. But you have to. Some of that's useful to have understand some of that brain, the kind of the mentality within government at that time, and why privatisations were seen as a good idea ideologically, even though none of the evidence really supported that they were a good idea. Even at that point, it was quite well understood how it wouldn't be a good idea on a number of measures. So let's return to our adventures through time. We also have to think, this is not the start, thanks Lynn, this is not the start of privatisation. The Railways Act 1993 was not the start of privatisation. You could argue that privatisation really started, the divvying off to private entities of bits of British Rail started back in 1969, actually, with the incorporation under the Companies Act of British Rail Engineering Limited. That was back in 1969. it was still held underneath BR. So yes, it was an arm's length company, but it was a national company. But it was the start of that restructuring into corporate entities. Proper privatisation, started in 1984. Again, Lynn, you can correct me on this one. Started in 1984 when Sea-Link was sold off to sea containers. RIP. So that was the end of ferries that had the BR logo on them, sadly. But so this process had started already, but it started in anger. Or rather, the article to begin the process writ large was the Railways Act 1993, which was assented royally on the 5th of November 1993, I think, and on the 1st of here it is. Oh, in fact, shall I read this? I don't know. I will read this. It's such a garbled nonsense. An act to provide for the Railways Act 1993. An act to provide for the appointment and functions of a rail regulator and a director of passenger rail franchising and of users consultative committees for the railway industry and for certain ferry services. To make new provision with respect to the provision of railway services and the persons by whom they are to be provided or who are to secure their provision. To make provision for and in connection with the grant and acquisition of rights over and the disposal of other transfer and vesting of any property, rights or liabilities by means of which railway services are or are to be provided. To amend the function of the British Railways Board to make provision with respect to the safety of railways and the protection of railway employees and members of the public from personal injury and other risks arising from the construction or operation of railways. To make further provision with respect to transport police. To make provision with respect to certain railway pension schemes. To make provision in connection with the payment of grants and subsidies in connection with railways and in connection with the provision of facilities for freight haulage by inland waterway. To make a provision in relation to tramways and other guided transport systems and for connected purposes. There we are. The appropriately titled Railways Act 1993. It did quite a lot of things. Anyway, in any case, on the 1st of April 1994, the Railways Act came into effect, and the demise of British Rail began. This was different to previous privatisations in that it was very much a fire sale. Oh my goodness. Yeah, right, here we go. Neil Gwynn is pointing out one of the issues is how on earth do you compare like with like? It doesn't make any sense. Absolutely, it doesn't make any sense. Thanks, Graham. I am indeed breathing. I know that some people have said Christian Walmar's written well on the subject of railway privatisation. I would agree with that for the contextual stuff, but I think Christian isn't as good at pulling together exactly why it's made the mess that we have today. Christian's best writing was absolutely at the time of when he was in amongst it as a journalist, so had all the right connections and could dig deep into understanding what was going on within kind of and asking the question of what's the point of all this. I think joining up the dots and bringing it into today's context, Christian's not as strong at. So his writings at the time very good. I'm not convinced by the latest BR history book necessarily. Anyway, right. So 1st of April 1994. The first private entity to be created as part of this was Railtrack, which took over the rail infrastructure such as track, signals, stations, this stuff. So we're going to start with the infrastructure. Oh, I didn't actually put anything there. 1st of April 1994, nothing. Yeah, blank sheet of paper. Let's say that was planned. So we're going to go through the various bits of railway, right? So the first thing, the infrastructure. We had Railtrack. Railtrack was created. Railtrack was created as a contract management organisation because Railtrack, in theory, wasn't supposed to do anything. It was supposed to be a holding company to hold a bunch of assets, and then but you would have 7 different infrastructure maintenance units and 6 track renewal units split off from BR to then undertake the kind of the maintenance, the operating, generally kind of running the system. So Railtrack would be a contract management organisation and the employer of the signallers. That was essentially its purpose. That was kind of the point of Railtrack as envisaged by the vampires. So then, what next? Well, passenger operations. In terms of the actual passenger operators. Wait a minute, why have I got that? This is why never to make slides in a rush because you never know where it's going to go. Is that logical? Oh yes, it is. Yeah. No, that is actually fine. I kind of was doing. I'm doing what I meant to do. Everything's well. So we also then so that's the infrastructure. The operators. I know there's a bit missing there that you might think, and we'll come back to the trains. But the actual operators were the next kind of thing to start getting created. Actually, that's not true, because the freight operators were the next thing to be created. So I'm going to pull those up here. There we are, and put this into the right order. Yes, good, fine. So, sorry, the freight operators are the next thing to be created. I knew there was something wrong. Freight operators are the next thing to be created, and 6 freight operators, or is that 7? 6 freight operators were created. You can see them all there, of which some kind of retained their BR identities, and 3 were completely new. Mainline, load haul, and Transrail were kind of completely new, but again, they were really spinning out elements of BR. That's not the official Freightliner logo. I kind of had to bodge that one together because I can't find the original Freightliner logo anywhere. It's just not on the internet, which is kind of annoying. So anyway, there we go. All of these, actually, ironically, every single one of those except Freightliner got gobbled up by EWS within a couple of years, but that's another story. So we've got these 6 freight operating companies, fine. Passenger operators, they were the next, and we ended up with 25 passenger operating units. So there we go, quite a lot of and all of these supposedly operating as completely autonomous entities, completely separated from each other. And then kind of from 1996 onwards, these train operating units, as they were called, would then be franchised out as train operating companies. We're missing a thing, of course, aren't we? We are missing the trains. So what happened to the trains? Well, I would say this is probably the most criminal element of the privatisation of the railways, because the infrastructure wasn't really sold off and then made money out of in the same way that the trains were. And these trains had been scrimped and saved for by BR. Selling off little bits of land here and there to pay for 1 or 2 trains left, right and centre. These were then sold off at rock bottom prices, an enormous range of hugely valuable trains, by 3 rolling stock operating companies. Here they are, all 3 rolling stock operating companies. Those trains were then leased back to train operators, and as they still are today, at eye-watering cost, with very little oversight, enabling a substantial, an enormous outflow of cash, a hemorrhaging of cash from the industry. It's little coincidence that these groups were initially run by consortia of banks, and continue, by the way, to have finances that are funneled via low or zero tax regimes to obfuscate their earnings. Like, these earn cash in a way that no one talks about and is absolutely enormous and quite difficult to understand. And it's definitely incentivized it's incentivized lots of bad behaviours, but the one that's probably the most annoying to passengers day to day is the fact that this incentivizes probably one of the kind of British passengers' biggest gripes, which is the common use of trains that are as short as possible to minimise leasing costs, without any care for the level of overcrowding that this results in. So rather than having trains that are just the maximum length they can be for the bit of railway they're running on, you go for the train that's the minimum length it can be to satisfy the franchise requirements of how many seats you're allowed to run at minimum, which is clearly absolutely bonkers and has constrained demand enormously. Despite the fact that people are desperately wanting to travel by train. If those restrictions had not been in place, then we would have seen growth. We would have seen more growth on the railways than we did anyway. So, and there's another impact of this that's worth talking about. So, the Roscoe's landing like this large, cheap asset that they could essentially rent out, rentier economy, rent out at high prices, with the fact that this basically killed off the UK train manufacturing industry. So if we jump to, we look at 1990, where we had quite a few, these kind of the main manufacturers sort of spread around, Glasgow, Birmingham, Loughborough, Derby, Manchester, Leeds and York, as the main ones. There are other bits and pieces going, but those are the main kind of manufacturers at that point. As a result of, in the aftermath of privatisation, the only contracts that were kind of being fulfilled at that point were the ones that BR still had out. So it's BR's kind of partially fulfilled orders which remained on the books. At that point, no new passenger trains would be built at volume until the early 2000s. So from privatisation onwards, there was just a kind of a vacuum of new train manufacturing. So, so we've seen that kind of within 10 years, actually, most of those are closed. By 2005, only Derby remained. Yeah. And we've seen new plants popping up in Newton Aycliffe. So Newton Aycliffe here. Let me get this right about here. And also down in Newport here. Those two have appeared and are already at risk and under threat again, thanks to the lack of any long-term rolling stock strategy. So really not, in terms of like the Roscoes, incentivized some of the worst behaviours, make most of the cash disappear, and destroyed our domestic train manufacturing industry. Oof, not good, really. Not good. Deirdre is pointing out a very key point. So the good comparator of this throughout the whole time is what was happening in Ireland, but also in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland, part of the UK, subject to lots of the same rules, fully nationalised, vertically integrated network. It saw the same kind of percentage rises in passenger usage that were being seen in GB, that's it. So it's interesting to get. Deirdre's pointing out the effect of this was so stark when travelling by train in Ireland on New Year's Eve. We were able to spread out and have some comfort. Also, nice design carriages in terms of luggage, etc. Absolutely. So I love there's some discussion going on about London Water in the background here, which is interesting. I have no idea what the chaos is in the background. So, and that's not the end of it either. So, also we had to have contract managers, regulators to sit on top of that. So you have a franchising authority, an economic regulator, and a safety regulator. Actually, at that time, the safety regulator was within HMRI, and associated bodies was within the Health and Safety Executive. But these three entities and quite a few others also were added to that pile of bits and pieces that formed the privatised railway, on top of those little pile of regulators there, because I've screwed up the animations on my slide deck, obviously, because I hammered through this because I was in a call until much later than I intended to be. That's fine though, because I can do editing on the fly. So we went from British Rail, single entity. Yes, it had sectorisation, but it very much was a single powerful autonomous body, autonomous entity, and then we disintegrated into all of this lot, all of these bits with a huge number of different contractual arrangements between each other. You had train operating companies that would like have to do stuff to rail track. And they also had their relationship with the franchising authority. They also had to rent trains from one or probably all three of the Roscoes. You had they then had to interact with the ORR to be regulated. They also then had to deal with HMRI to prove their safety case. Then obviously the relationship then from these elements out into actual central government as well. So what a mess. Just not good. Raphael Nicolaus, the economic regulator was the ORR. So the ORR's original remit, now changed somewhat, but the original remit of the ORR was simply economic regulation, so making sure that they delivered to their financial promises, according to the Director of Passenger Rail Franchising, which was what the original franchising authority was down here. A mess, a big bloody mess. By 1st of April 1997, all the franchises have been awarded. We had a plethora of regulating organising bodies, kind of stitching the system together. Privatisation was essentially complete. We had our joyous spread of colours, which I have to say I don't like. I don't think having a million liveries is a good thing. I think it's a mess, but there we go. It was done. And most importantly, that the outgoing administration's goal of finishing this off, of scorching the earth before the next general election, had been achieved. They'd managed it. And despite promises to the contrary, New Labour came into power and did nothing to reverse the process. They kind of proposed that they would try and stitch it back together a bit as more of a controlled thing with this heavily late 90s, early 2000s logo, Strategic Rail Authority. But bear that in mind, because they did not succeed in creating it at that point. They talked about it, they did not create it, because things were happening. So only months after all the franchise had been awarded, we had an express train collide with a freight train at Southall in London. Killed 7 people, it injured 139 others. And a lack, the cause of this was a lack of effective communication between the fragmented elements of the railway. So there wasn't enough discussion between signallers and between train operating companies. That's the root cause of this horrific crash. And it was the first of a series of fatal derailments, all of which were attributable to the new structure of the railways. Other people can spin it any way they like, but all of these were attributable to the new structure of the railways. I should have said there's a bit of content warning, but these are sufficiently far away pictures that I figured that they're not. There's nothing too unpleasant within them. The first, in October 1999, there was so that was September 97. Jump forwards a couple of years to October 1999, and 31 people were killed at Ladbroke Grove, which was as a result of kind of regulatory issues that had continued off the back of BR but had not been resolved and had been slowed down by privatisation, the process of privatisation, the fragmentation it caused, and inadequate safety regulation. There was just inadequate safety regulation over the structure. And by only a year later, Hatfield happened in October 2000. 4 people were killed, 70 injured. This sent shockwaves through the industry, particularly the infrastructure side, because it had resulted directly from the fact that Railtrack perceived itself. There was a self-perception that it was a contract management organisation, not an engineering one. And it was like, no, we just manage contracts. There's nothing to do with this. About the consequences of what we do is not. We're just managing the contracts, which did not work. Hence why Hatfield happened. And this, as a result of the billions that had to be spent in desperately, gargantuan and rushed effort to replace kind of thousands of miles of substandard track materials. Well, actually, not all of them are substandard. Billions of pounds were spent, and this basically binned Railtrack. It was absorbed into a new government body called Network Rail. Enter Network Rail. Hooray! Some positive progress in the right direction. So it's an interesting one. So Raphael Nicolaus, actually, the evidence is such that there was not an increase in the overall number of fatalities on the railway as a result of privatisation. To be fair, statistically, that isn't the case. But there were several very publicly dramatic, kind of visible, dramatic major rail crashes that resulted from the structure of the industry. And I'm sure there's all sorts of data analysis you can do that would pick up and understand the difference between overall crashes happening in post-BR, how much of those were as a result of general improvements in safety that had kind of continued through BR era, and perhaps were the consequence of BR improvements to safety through sectorisation, compared with this elevation of big, dramatic, publicly visible crashes, and how much that also coincided with more news, more rolling television news, and so that increased the visibility as well. I think that picture is a little complex, but there were several. The key thing that's worth remembering: there were several significant, publicly visible, fatal derailments that resulted directly from the structure of the privatised industry. So, Network Rail were created. But that didn't stop this tranche of fatal derailments, unfortunately, because in May 2002, 7 people were killed by the negligence of a private maintenance company. One of those kind of hugely fragmented elements. One of them, Jarvis, who proceeded to desperately say it was sabotage over and over again, trying to get off the hook. Jarvis had not properly maintained a set of points. The stretcher bars failed, and a Happy Train, a 365, derailed at speed and killed 6 people in the train and dropped some brickwork off a bridge down and killed someone underneath the bridge as well. So, really not good. And again, this actually, again, attributable to a private maintenance company, and this led to all of these infrastructure maintenance units and track renewal units being absorbed into Network Rail. Not all, but most maintenance tasks were returned in-house to Network Rail. And by this point, so kind of by the time this reconstitution of Railtrack as Network Rail had concluded in kind of October 2002, Britain's rail infrastructure had been de facto renationalised. And that's not specifically, it's not exactly true, but essentially Network Rail had been renationalised. And in 2013, actually, this ended up becoming official because Network Rail was brought onto the Treasury books. So officially, 2013 renationalisation of the infrastructure, but it de facto happened in 2002. So, actually, there's a thing. Don't want to roll with me scroll wheel. I'll come down here and have a look at some stuff. So, kind of a little. little breather and a sip of tea. Is this making sense? Is the yarn weaving itself sufficiently? You can sort of see the direction things are going, right? So overall passenger and worker safety had continued to improve through the early years of privatisation. But these and other these crashes and some other highly public tragedies exposed kind of systematic failures in the fragmented structure of the industry. Lynn Baxter might be able to add things to this. Look up some of Lynn's writings on the subject. Definitely do. And also the video that she did with David Turner on this is really good. The structure of the industry that, as it had been drawn up by Treasury, had resulted in some of these systemic failures were as a result of that structure. And if the first 5 years following completion of privatisation would be about exposing those failures, the next 15 years would be about unpicking that structure pretty much in its entirety. We jump forwards to February 2001, or kind of rather, we jump back a bit. So we were talking about October 2002 when Network Rail was kind of fully created, but let's jump back a little actually to February 2001 because the Strategic Rail Authority was created. And it absorbed the Office of Passenger Rail Franchising, and it aimed to take a kind of a complete view of the rail network and its development. And a keystone in this was the modernisation of the West Coast Main Line. Here it is. We have to talk a little bit about the West Coast Main Line. We have on Rail Natter talked quite a bit on the West Coast Main Line and kind of what it meant to the rail network, the British rail network. It had long been considered the jewel in the crown of the UK's, the kind of England and Scotland's rail network, certainly. It had been electrified and modernised through the 50s, 60s and 70s, and prior to the early 90s recession, BR had been developing plans for significant upgrades to the route alongside a new fleet of trains. Damn it, I missed the opportunity to put in the Intercity 250 here, didn't I? Oh, what a failure. Anyway, that picture will be going on Twitter later, but all of you have seen that picture anyway, because when I go run around the museum, I invariably go and find the model that has that livery on it. The Intercity 250 was part of the plans, kind of after the failure of APT, see previous episodes. Intercity 250 was the proposed replacement. And that kind of fell to one side as a result of the recession. It didn't so much kill the plans off, but it essentially put them into deep freeze. They were picked up again, really, by Richard Branson's Virgin. So when Virgin Trains appeared, post-privatisation, they wanted to introduce new tilting trains, they wanted a much more frequent timetable, all the things that Intercity 250 project was supposed to deliver. And what started in 1998 is a promise for a 140-mile-an-hour railway with full digital signalling, so a radical, massive promises of what an upgrade to the existing railway could achieve. This should be familiar, everyone. By the early 2000s, this had descended into chaos, and this was actually contributed to Railtrack's demise as well. It wasn't just the safety issues. So for example, in 1998, the plan was that this would cost about 2.5 billion, and in 2002, it was costing, in 2002 prices, 14.5 billion pounds. That's 25 billion in today's money. That's a lot of money. And indeed, when I gave my evidence to the Transport Select Committee on the Integrated Rail Plan, this example is the one I pointed out, saying, folks, the IRP, it's going to be a disaster again. We've done this before. Anyway, and indeed, how much of a calamity the West Coast route modernisation was led, within, I think it was about a year and a half or 2 years, all of the additional capacity, all of it was absorbed. So every new seat that had been created was pretty much filled up. And as a result of that, Network Rail indeed and we'll come back to why this report came out, but for various reasons, by 2007, Network Rail had published a new report talking about the need for new railway lines to meet capacity challenges, particularly on the West Coast Main Line, but elsewhere as well. And indeed, government was behind the scenes commissioning other bodies to look at, Andrew McNaughton was looking at high-speed lines as well, but more on that momentarily. Let's return to 2005. So, West Coast route modernisation had hopelessly extended its costs, so the Strategic Rail Authority was tasked with bringing the massive project into line. But by 2002, costs had risen, as we talked about. The scope of the project had already been severely curtailed, back to 125 miles an hour tilt only. Digital signalling had gone pretty much entirely out the window. And and any benefits the upgrades afforded were pretty much absorbed immediately. Indeed, yeah. So I was talking about the New Lines program. Pretty much before the main works complete in 2007. This report came out in main works concluded in 2008. This report came out in 2000, or kind of the work for it began in 2007. So even before the works had been completed fully, it became clear that it was not enough, and a new high-speed line was required anyway. Hence, HS2 appeared. But we'll get to that. And yes, we know that the Integrated Rail Plan has kind of somewhat unlearned this lesson. So, it may not have been perfect, but the Strategic Rail Authority had kind of provided the rail industry with some level of long-term vision, considerable kind of organisational funding on autonomy. Guess who didn't like this? They were slow off the mark for sure because of Railtrack's demise, but they had started successfully awarding. They'd awarded, 2 or 3, or maybe not like that. They'd started the process of awarding their 20-year franchises. So they'd thought, if we do a 20-year franchise, it can work better. We can actually have some long-term investment, Chiltern style, in the infrastructure as well, and think of the railway a bit more as a system. However, this combination of long-termism and the decentralised autonomy was an anathema not just to Treasury, but also it kind of ran against the continued New Labour pushes for centralisation, which meant there was a battle to be had. And funnily enough, if you go up against Treasury, the chances are you will lose. And indeed, the Railways Act 2005 abolished the Strategic Rail Authority. So in 2005, Strategic Rail Authority gone. That meant that franchising and long-term strategy development went to DFT. The Department for Transport got it. So less than a decade after privatisation had completed, the railways were under greater government control than at any time before in their history. So not only had privatisation disintegrated and failed on its own merits, but it actually resulted in government, central government, getting more power over the railways than ever before in history. Not good. Anyway, nevertheless, by this point, it was actually good. There was some good stuff going on. The tide had turned on the railways. Railways were by far their most popular since the early part of the 20th century. Passenger numbers were enormous. There was cross-party consensus that rail investment and the expansion of the rail network were a good thing. Franchises previously let as not for growth, such as those in Wales and the North, were kind of creaking at the seams as people were turning to trains. Suburban demand was enormous on both of those franchises. The demise of steel and coal traffic kind of notwithstanding, rail freight was also booming. So you had this enormous boom in rail freight as well. So let's jump forwards to 2007. Tony Blair, that guy, his government published another white paper called Delivering a Sustainable Railway. This is a bit of a weird paper because this essentially vetoed further electrification on the network, and it instead suggested that biodiesel was the path to a clean railway. Within a few months of this getting published, Blair was gone, Brown had arrived, and Gordon Brown had appointed this chap. Slightly weird Blair obsessive nowadays. He's a little bit lost the plot, but that's fine. At the time, probably a pretty good, in fact not probably, he was a pretty good Secretary of State for Transport. He was appointed as Secretary of State for Transport by Gordon Brown. Not only did Adonis push for new strategic electrification, but he also initiated the development of High Speed 2. So he got Andrew McNaughton in, he initiated High Speed 2, he got Network Rail, kind of supporting Network Rail and their development of the need for new lines. So weirdly, Gordon Brown very much flipped the Blair administration's agnosticism towards enhancing and expanding the railway network, because I'm afraid Blair's attitude to the railways was at best. So let's see. This isn't the end of the story, though. We have some issues going on here, because around about this time, and kind of getting worse and worse, now that the Department for Transport had full control over franchising and franchise agreements and all of this stuff, the fact that capacity was becoming more limited, and so the need to direct and be precise over what provision was required was growing enormous. So these, from what have been quite short documents of the original franchise agreements, those contracts were now, even the kind of the invitations to tender documents were files that were huge piles and piles of files. They're growing more complex, more restrictive, And that meant the numbers of bidders reduced, and indeed the ambition of their bids, in order that the few that were left could win them, became increasingly unrealistic. And this reached a head in... Oh yeah, that's right, the new line scheme. This reached a head in 2009 when National Express East Coast was stripped of the East Coast franchise after failing to meet its ridiculously unrealistic payment targets. Despite the fact that passenger growth was enormous, they had just bid... They had won the bid off the back of just insanely unrealistic targets for paying money back to the DFT. And that was kind of the first domino to fall, really, in the franchise system. So it's a major, not so much a canary in the coal mine as much of the coal mine collapsing in on itself. So that was 2009. Jump forwards to, obviously that then became East Coast, as we all know. 2012, things were not getting better. 2012, the West Coast franchise bidding process was scrapped by government. It was awarded as essentially a short-term concession pending a review. And amid a wider crisis across the industry, I kind of jumped on that. East Coast was formed as essentially a nationalised operator. So that East Coast operation was essentially a publicly owned and operated passenger service. So 2012, West Coast mainline franchise competition was cancelled. There was kind of the short-term concession pending review. And indeed, kind of as we'll get to, in June 2018, the East Coast franchise, which had been awarded again, fell in itself. But we will jump forwards to that momentarily. Peter's saying, what about Connex? Oh yeah, Connex went under or restricted rights due to the service. Oh yeah, nice, thank you. Very good point. So, 2016. We need to talk about 2016. And what had really started happening in terms of strikes. Why were the 2016 strikes happening? Well, there's a complex range of things going on. So the bids that we've talked about, these increasingly overambitious bids, kind of combined with the ever more complex and controlling contracts from DFT, kind of only left one lever open to the train operators to cut costs, and that was staffing. One big lever on it, and it said staff numbers, and you could just kind of wangle that lever about. That was all that was left to the bidders. That was the only lever they had. And remember that generally the whole point of train operating companies is to negotiate worse terms with its staff to reduce costs. That's the only thing. That's really the only point of them. And that's kind of a really key thing to understand about the way that this sort of the privatisation of public services is about driving down working conditions, making working conditions worse in order to pay staff less, in order to have fewer staff, because that's how you bring costs down. You're essentially outsourcing the negotiation of those public services, because invariably the taxpayer is the one still paying for those services. It's just that you're outsourcing to a private company and paying that private company some money in order to reduce working conditions, which is not a great idea, really. Because then you get to the point where a public service run on goodwill, and it's only run on goodwill, and all it's run on is goodwill, and those people decide to withdraw their goodwill, the public service ceases to function, which, spoiler alert, we're getting there. Anyway, so that staffing lever is all there was. So from 2016 onwards, this kind of wave of increasingly disruptive strikes took hold of the network. Enormous amount of disruption from strikes, because terms and conditions were being altered to attempt to reduce the number of staff the train operating companies had to have on their books. Whether it was driver-only operation, or whether it was just getting rid of guards altogether, or whether it was shifting the responsibility between different train staff, altering rosters, all this stuff, because the only lever that was there was the staffing lever. And so just as the kind of the industry's new structure back in 93 had resulted in the creation of the Roscoes, which incentivised a freeze in new train procurement. Yeah, we have to think a bit about Railtrack, actually. Just as the Roscoes had kind of incentivised that freeze in new train procurement, the creation of Railtrack and its private suppliers had done a similar thing to recruitment for infrastructure. Right the way across the infrastructure domain, there's a big gap there's almost a generational gap in terms of infrastructure engineers. You've got the surge of kind of people sort of 5 years before I joined the industry of kind of a surge of, oh shit, we need a bigger railway, we need to employ some people. But there's a big gap before that, and with that gap came a big shedding of knowledge. That knowledge was shed in the form of literal knowledge being put into skips by the private companies. They were like, oh, we don't need all this asset knowledge, let's just put it in the bin. Bonkers. but also in all the staff who either sacked it in because of BR coming to a close, they're like, I'll take my pension and leave, or the various kind of restructurings that meant people were left and were shed, or the fact these companies just reduced their headcount generally, or the fact they were seen as contract management organisations, so didn't employ proper engineering kind of staff anyway. So all of this, a good question being asked by Remy Cardona about train maintenance. It does fit into the picture, but it doesn't kind of fit. It doesn't necessarily. It kind of sits within the narrative, but I kind of skipped over it a bit. But yeah, that does fit into the picture as well. The maintenance of trains certainly is a complicated picture. But anyway, so yeah, fair point. We'll do a bit of a Q&A when I reach the kind of a bit of a dramatic moment soon, and we'll do some Q. In fact, we'll do a Q&A at the end. So scoop up and store all your questions, folks. Anyway, so sorry, I digress. We've got this big gap in recruitment. A skills this kind of. If you like, a decade-wide gap in skills as a consequence of this. And with that growth in passenger demand came a huge growth in the number of infrastructure projects being procured, being carried out. And that skills bottleneck, combined with an industry structure kind of outside of this as well. So the relationship with like some of the big contractors, and also to an extent having less in-house knowledge of the consultancies as well. Consultancies, and there's loads of these. So plus, lots of them, and they all have relationships with each other that make no sense, and relationships back and forth, and scribble. The point of that is that it's a mess. This sort of all of this industry structure exacerbating costs by essentially maximising the number of organisational interfaces, and for the bigger industry as well. So all the complexity of train operating companies, freight operating companies, etc. None of them can benefit off each other. It's all lots of contractual boundaries. All those organisational interfaces meant that work was being carried out. It's being delivered too slowly and at too high a cost, far too high a price. And by 2017, these cost escalations had become kind of unbearable for government. So not only did this result in, as we all know, painfully, the curtailment of the National Electrification Programme, but also in the abandonment of lots of other enhancements across the country, particularly in Manchester and across the north of England. Meanwhile, we had this glut of new train orders from a train manufacturing sector that had kind of only invented itself fairly recently and was bottlenecking through Derby and Newton Aycliffe. So, and also borrowing new suppliers who didn't know what they were doing from Europe, and they had to learn the process a lot. So we had a situation where we had, also the new train orders were, by the way, for new electric trains for which there were no longer overhead wires being planned to actually power them. So let's jump to May 2018, the dark day. Oof. So, I love that people are still talking about water, which is bonkers. May 2018. This is supposed to be a moment where we would have an enormous leap in capacity created. We were going to have loads of electrification, capacity release, new capacity projects happening. So, essentially, we were supposed to have new trains, and as a result of that, we'd get a great leap in the number of trains running in the timetable. As it happened, as we've just discussed, neither the track nor the trains were in place to deliver much of this uplift. Trains were way behind schedule on delivery, or couldn't move because there were no wires. Capacity uplift projects have been cancelled. Capacity enhancement projects have been cancelled. The result of that was a collapse in the reliability of the system, and a total failure of the timetable. Driver training couldn't happen. A lack of trains, tracks, staff result in the cancellation of like over a third of services in the southeast and north of England. There were significant effects across the whole network. The whole franchise system at this point was massively under duress. Hugely under duress of everyone going, the system doesn't fucking work. What the hell are you going to do about it, government? And, it was bad enough that the ORR actually did their own independent inquiry, which is a bit of a, milquetoast sort of document. But it kind of attempted to capture all the problems. Huge, just a complete breakdown in the way the railway system worked. Of course, then, as we talked about earlier, jumped kind of a month or two forwards, or barely that, just off the back of this collapse in the timetable, Virgin Trains East Coast went pop. Because of their own over-optimistic bids, and that had to be returned to kind of nominal state operation under LNER. It's not quite as state operated as I'd like it to be, but it is essentially a state operation. By this point, franchise bidders were few and far between. They were getting even more unhappy because they were getting shouted at by government when it was mostly out of the control of the train. The train operating companies don't own any trains. They don't own any track. They have influence over neither of them. And at that point, they were like, we can't train our drivers because we haven't got any track and trains. We're being shouted at for not delivering a timetable that we haven't got the tools to deliver either track or trains. This isn't fair. We're not interested. And the number of bidders essentially evaporated. It dried up. No one was interested. Hardly anyone interested. System really was absolutely creaking and close to collapse at this point. Hence the Williams Review. So the Williams Rail Review was initiated later that year in 2018, this kind of the whole debacle had been kind of topped off by it's where there's a bit of context. The whole debacle, the collapse of Virgin Trains East Coast, kind of topped the whole debacle off, and Chris Grayling, much as we are not necessarily fans of Chris Grayling, he had never been a fan of the franchise system. In fact, he'd been a kind of a vocal opponent of the franchise system and of the lack of integration between track and train. So, as Secretary of State for Transport, he initiated the Williams Rail Review in 2018. It was to kind of work out what shape the industry needed to be in to enable growth without kind of cycling right back to calamity again. Foreshadowing. The review took a lot of time to pick up speed and very much left the industry in kind of perpetual crisis mode. Yeah. Then this happened. And as you know, from the fact that RailNatter literally came out of the existence of COVID, we saw a collapse in ridership and a consequent leap in kind of percentage subsidy, right? A bit like what happened off the back of the 90s, the early 90s recession. A dramatic rise in operating subsidy. And as a result of that, government panicking again and ripping up this kind of cross-party consensus that more rail is good. Ridership was reduced to 5% of pre-COVID levels. Industry was very much put on life support, rightly so. By the end of that month, all of the franchises were transferred onto emergency concessions, and that was it. Franchise system gone. This was made official in September 2020. I should have done a little card for this, never mind. I definitely should have done a slide for it. As the government stated that franchising was to cease to exist. That was it. And by April 2021, the National Audit Office had said that train operators were to be officially classified as state-owned, despite the continued involvement of private companies. Pointless involvement of private companies. I should have pointless in brackets, because all they're doing is taking 1.5% to question mark? Anyway, finally, in May 2021, the Williams-Shapps Plan for Rail was published. Oh, surely some progress. We're going to see things happening, right? Setting out a loose, and admittedly loose, and we've covered this. We're in RailNatter territory now. We've covered this. We've reached the almost present day. Setting out a loose view of the future structure of the railways. It very much lacked in detail, as we covered, but the headline was that a new organisation called GBR, Great British Railways, was to be created. A transition team was established to understand what GBR would do, how it would be structured. Worth noting, though, that the Roscoes, as the last major vestige of the Railways Act 1993, remained untouched. Yes. So, it's not the end of the story, though, is it? Because, despite the fact that ridership has recovered to pretty much between 90 and 100% of pre-COVID levels, and yes, trends away from the traditional commute have been accelerated, but London rail travel is still climbing. We are still seeing ridership climbing. On most intercity services across regional networks, kind of ridership, as we know, is well above pre-COVID levels. But an indecisive government, which we know is now locked off, kind of completely locked itself into a room in perpetual crisis, means that the Williams-Shapps Plan has all but been scrapped. It's pretty much gone. I think that it's going to be, we saw that stupid competition about the headquarters being swept under the table. We've seen the fact that this is just being, the Treasury never wanted the big autonomy shift to happen anyway. Just as with the Levelling Up white paper, this has just been binned, essentially. It's been got rid of. So several operators still running a 60% timetable despite high passenger numbers. Crowding is worse than ever before. Network Rail has been forced by Treasury to cut thousands of jobs. Pressures are also being put on train operators to reduce headcounts. That stasis that we saw from back in May 2018, has yet to be alleviated. No changes to the industry structure have happened. Nothing at all. So, the impact on passengers, rail freight users in industry, the workforce of the industry cannot be overstated. This deadlock nothing's changed. I keep pointing out, we had that big crisis in May 2018. Nothing has changed since. So, of course, everything's still in crisis mode. And there we go. So, at that point, what the hell is next? We've got this stasis, and we've covered this in RailNatter. All you good folks, RailNatter watchers, we know that there are that there has to be a next step. And actually, all the clever people, all the people actually know what they're talking about, know what that next step should be. It's about the fact that we need, we've in fact, I can read out the kind of nominally read out what I've got at the end of my piece, because it kind of summarises the whole picture, right? Which is, transport represents the UK's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The cost of living crisis is hitting people incredibly hard. So there's never been a more important time for the rail industry to step up and move more people and more things around the country. 89% of UK journeys are by road, and only 9% are by rail, which means that even with kind of that overall reduction in the number of miles moved, rail still needs to absorb a significant modal shift. And a 10% modal shift from road to rail requires a 100% increase in rail's modal share. A doubling of the number of trains in simple terms compared to today, or rather compared to pre-COVID, frankly. And also, at the same time, the costs of motoring are increasing for individuals and businesses. So the railway, can and should be providing an affordable and efficient alternative, alongside integrated buses and other public transport. And to accommodate these shifts, the railway needs to be empowered to take on a structure that enables it to achieve its ultimate outcomes and works best for its users. Those outcomes need to be set by government, but you have to have a level of empowerment of the railway industry to actually achieve those outcomes. For me, as we talked about in RailNatter, democratic accountability at kind of local and regional levels is absolutely key to unlocking the cycle of proposed and cancelled investment. But more on that momentarily. It's time to answer some questions. I'm going to go big face very briefly. Hello, everyone. That was a bit of a mouthful, wasn't it? Golly, and I'm 7 minutes over episode time. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm running back through the questions. Here we are. Watch government try and franchise out LNER before the election out of pure spite. Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, the system's not fixed. It's just worse than it ever was. Yes. Oof. So, much like with energy, Britain risks becoming a country where transport is expensive because of daft past decisions. Absolutely. Energy prices are enormous in Britain, uniquely enormous in Britain, because of all the stupidity of the privatisation of the energy system. Oh golly, what a mess. Okay, chuck questions for me. I'll close out, and then we'll do questions before the end, as is traditional. So let me miniaturize my face. Remember to at me in for questions so I can spot them. Yes, so we want that democratic accountability, kind of at local, regional levels, to kind of unlock that cycle of proposed and then cancelled, and then proposed and then cancelled investment, and in order to kind of push operators to do better. Democratic accountability. What do I mean by that? Well, in the aftermath of May 2018 timetable meltdown, and indeed in the recent repeating of the same mistakes, it's the likes of kind of the Rail North Committee within TfN and other subnational transport bodies that are actually holding the industry's feet to the fire over the poor services. And not Westminster. Transport Select Committees the Transport Select Committee can only do so much. The reality is that the accountability is happening through those local passenger bodies, whether it's the Rail North Committee or others, or whether it's councils or and so on. So that means that the devolution of decision and funding powers needs to happen both to the regions and the cities, but also to industry itself, so that it can respond quickly to these demands. We live in a pretty changeable kind of society, and contrary to what people might tell you, the public sector is much more responsive than the private sector. The private sector is very risk averse. It wants to do the same thing over and over again so that it just makes the most money and gives dividends to its shareholders. Whereas the public sector, as we saw through COVID, can, at the turn of a heel, respond to a crisis. It can go, right, okay, we can subsidise, we can have a rail industry that's now just prioritising delivery for key workers, moving key workers around, getting PPE about, moving freight about. They can do that at the turn of a heel, compared to a private industry which just could not do that. So this is really key thing to grasp and understand is that if we want a responsive industry, only the public sector can deliver that responsiveness. So my view is that we have to have an empowerment of the rail industry as a self-governing body that is accountable chiefly to the UK's regions and cities, not to central government and treasury. That's a critical step. That's the empower the rail industry, make it accountable to local and regional democracy, not to central government. That's the only way we're going to kick things out of crisis mode and kind of reshape the industry to be fit for the long-term future. Oh, them's me views. Whew. That was a bit of a roaring, rip-roaring yarn, but hopefully, let me know. Questions. Do tell me what you think and what your thoughts are and whether you see how that kind of... Hopefully that shows how everything is connected. All those decisions that were made as part of the Railways Act 1993 have led us straight to the mess we're in now was an inevitability. It's not an unhappy consequence or an unhappy side effect. It was an inevitability of the structure that was created for the Railways Act 1993 by the Adam Smith Institute and Treasury. It was them what did it. So, let me remove my face and jump us to the usual outro, and then I'll pick up questions for the end part. Everyone, thanks for listening. This podcast will be available, hopefully not too long after it goes out now, in audio-only format on all good podcasting platforms. Particularly with the need for me to do quite a few pre-records for baby reasons, all of your support at Patreon is very much appreciated to keep these happening. Times are tight, so the fact that lots of you are still subscribing on Patreon is incredibly appreciated. It really does allow me to do more of this. And there are always plans afoot, but there's some interesting little plans afoot that we'll maybe talk about in a couple of episodes' time. Patreon.com/Gareth Dennis for that. PayPal.me/Gareth Dennis. As lots of you do, you're lovely who do, chuck in a penny. Some of you gave me Christmas presents through PayPal that I only noticed when I did my self-assessment. Actually, those are gifts that I didn't need to declare for tax reasons, but I kind of did anyway, because it kind of does sort of feel like income. But anyway, so the PayPal money that you send me is very much appreciated. PayPal.me/Gareth Dennis. And of course, the chat. Everyone in the chat here. GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord is where the YouTube chat continues. And my goodness, there is so much of it, and it's marvellous. Everyone in the chat, you've been wonderful. Lynn, I hope that did justice to the story and made sense and kind of weaved the yarn together. As you pointed out, your writings aren't quite out yet, but the discussion with Dr. David Turner is well worth it. Look up Lynn Baxter, see where Lynn's popped up. Actually, Lynn, we should have you on, shouldn't we, really? In fact, maybe we should have you on as part of this 1993 celebratory year. Yes, I will message you about that. That's a good idea. So, GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord for the Discord. Next week, episode 149, which is technically the 150th episode, right? Light rail does not exist, and other not a metro fun. Yeah, we're going to look at light rail and the fact that it simply does not exist. It's nonsense. It's a nonsense phrase. It's meaningless. I've made the Germans very angry about this because they're like, what are you on about? All of our stupidly named systems that we have in the Germanosphere make sense. No, they don't make sense. The not a retro sorter continues to be right. It's yet to be unproven. Reigning champion, so on. That's going to be fun next week. I'll try and do some sketches to explain some points, but it'll be a bit of a discussion point. Again, collect up your edge cases to throw at me, and we're going to be testing the not a metro sorter again, but with some particular examples off the back of the light rail doesn't exist discourse that happened a couple of weeks ago now. Oh, everyone, let's get back to my big pink face. Michael C. DLR, am I a joke to you? Yes, the Docklands Light Railway is wrongly named. It's not a light railway. It never was. It's a stupid name. But that's for next week. Yes, you're very welcome, Chris Bird. I'm glad it was an interesting run through the problems. Oh, yes, it's Statbahn fight time. Ariane Burns. Oh, also, Ariane, very good to have you. We should chat. We need to do an episode. I was chatting to John Worth after last week's episode. We should have a chat to do an episode about that. That'll be fun. Anyway, lots of exciting episode ideas bouncing around. Nothing more dull than arguing semantics with fellow transport nerds. Yeah, but it's the best kind of dull, isn't it? Let's face it. But as with all rail natter stuff, there's a reason for it, which is that there's a reason why calling stuff light rail is unhelpful and doesn't help either our policy causes or kind of understanding what the point of transport is. So, as in true rail natter style, we're trying to break out of that nerdocratic, technocratic discussion of, oh, well, light rail does exist because there's a law that says light rail. Yeah, but that law means nothing. It means nothing technically. It means nothing for what it delivers for passengers or municipal freight. Light rail doesn't exist. Anyway, that's for next week. The questions. So I've seen some ats up here. Let's have a look. Rafael Nicolaus, when will we see the system that is needed, if at all? Not anytime soon, because I'm not under the impression that Labour are going to introduce the right shape of system. They're not going to, the New Britain paper potentially looking at Treasury power, but unless Treasury is tackled absolutely head on, none of this works. You have to abolish the Treasury first. Tom, we need to lock long-term planning and funding into the system. Too much government work is hamstrung by ministers promising money for headlines, then forgetting about it when convenient. Absolutely, this is why you have to spin out. You spin out the control, so the funding is locked in to the railways, and ideally locked into devolved authorities for them to spend, not Treasury, and that will help tremendously because local and regional, city and regional authorities have a much better understanding of how transport has to be cross-party, has to be long-term. Central government does not. Let's see. What do I think of a German-style PSO tendering system? Could this be a model for the future? I don't think Britain's railway network has enough capacity to enable that sort of I just think that I just see the tendering process as being pointless. I don't see the need for any private involvement. You're paying for a load of additional lawyers and contract management people within central government that don't need to be there if you just have a public operated organisation that's essentially autonomous, its own body, British Rail, but and it should be British Rail, by the way. That should be the name of the entity. Should be called British Rail, but it's accountable to regional and local authorities. That's the critical thing. Let's see. So, private market, not so much about sustainability and long-term benefits, rather than about short-term profits. Absolutely, it's about annual profits. Hence why it's no good. Gareth Ethwy, question from earlier: was there a reason Labour government spun Brel out in 1969? That was off the back of the changes that were happening related to off the Barbara Castle. It's the 1968 Transport Act, I think, that resulted in the formation of Brel, and there was a general feeling of restructuring it to be like a corporate entity with kind of arm's length bodies. It's kind of continuing that thrust of corporatism, of corporatocracy. No, what's the word I'm looking for? Generally turning public bodies into private-looking companies. That was kind of the thrust of the 60s onwards, really. Let's see what else we got. Thanks, Davids. Jack Elliott, is the desired model basically just everyone gets a TFX? Pass. Graham Howarth, when is baby due? Very, very soon. Mid-Feb. Very, very soon. Let's see. Raphael, I've got the feeling that Britain's railways with privatisation, especially in that system, reverted back to whatever pre-grouping was. A bit. Yeah, sort of. Corporatocracy. That's the one. Thanks, Richard Smith. I need to say that more because it's a word I'm going to be using in the Engineer Plays series a bit. Spoiler alert. Let's see. Light rail would be a technical term. No, it's not even a technical term. It isn't anything. Right. Stephen Chaytow, despite missing out on Reopen Your Railway, could Peaks and Dales come to transform East Midlands rail and modal shift? No, probably not. I don't. There is a bit of a missing link in terms of the rail network there. I do think there is a missing link, but I think there are other. I think it comes back a little bit to our strategic needs. There's a fun episode coming up where I've pretty much finished the back end analysis for it. There's a fun episode coming up looking at what the rail network should have been structured as post nationalisation, instead of following the stupid structure of the pre-grouping and the grouping railways. Rather, what we should have prioritised as our main lines, and I think that'll help pick out some of those strategic gaps where we maybe be able to kind of answer some of those thoughts. I think there's a missing link at the area where kind of the Peaks and Dales kind of route that I know that MemRap are looking at, but I'm not 100% convinced on the idea of it being a useful reopening. I think actually a strategic rail link, potentially a freight link there, might be more useful. Let's see, what else? Labour's dominated now by Wes Streeting type guys, yeah, 100%. Let's see. Michael C. Could giving funding powers to local authorities potentially reduce likelihood of big cross-local border projects like HS2? Potentially. but you still need those big kind of overall kind of pan-regional projects. They still need to happen, and those are by their very nature going to be big political footballs. But driving more, if you have the big, in theory, if you devolve a large chunk of the funding of transport budget to local and regional authorities, if you've got the big strategic plan, they can deliver elements of the high speed line. You know, they could decide they're going to do the Goulburn link because they know it releases capacity for local services. You have some of that, and you end up with a kind of a combination of regional funding, central government funding. But this is where British Rail would be the ones who potentially would look at working with DfT and looking at the connections to local buses. You end up creating the integrated long-term transport plan and the map of what the network needs to look like. Let's see. Richard Smith is not keen on the German system. Imposes an artificial split between long distance and local regional trains and makes it harder to travel medium distances. Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Xander Veach, to what degree, in my opinion, should private industry be involved in the UK railway? How much work should be contracted out and how much in-house? My challenge would be come up with a good reason why it shouldn't be in-house. There might be some things that it's right that aren't in-house. I think train manufacturing, it makes sense that it would not be in-house. But you do need the in-house strategic rolling stock plan to then procure those trains. So I think there are some dotted lines that make sense. But my challenge would always be, right, take a thing, why shouldn't that thing be delivered in-house? Is there a good reason for it not to be delivered in-house? But my attitude is, it's more efficient for the thing to be done in-house by default, invariably, and challenge me to prove that it isn't. But that's my kind of default, particularly for the stuff that was within the remit of Railways Act 1993. Government should own those trains. Or rather, the rolling stock entities or regional authorities should own those trains, and they can then be operated by a train operator, which might well also be a part of a regional authority or local authority. So I think that's that, really. Jack Elliott is pointing out that train manufacturing does seem to be an increasingly small number of companies. To a greater or lesser extent, perhaps it's a good idea to have an incumbent kind of British Rail manufacturer, and then also but have them bid on an equal term with the likes of Stadler. Bearing in mind that Stadler, who are still very much a small entity, are delivering the best trains in the UK at the moment. So, but I think that it should be the case that the private sector justifies why it needs to be present, given that there's all that dividend shedding. It's like, okay, if you're going to justify all that money that very obviously isn't going straight back into public service, why? That, for me, feels like a starting point. Like, if it's in-house, that dividend shedding doesn't happen. You can be more innovative, because I'm sorry, public sector is more innovative. You can be more lean, you can be more responsive to crises, of which there are going to be more and more with public sector. Private sector needs to then go, well, in order to justify us paying a dividend and being a private company, we will provide this material benefit, and none of them do at the moment. So, I think that's feels like not a bad time to wave a farewell to everyone. That's gone on a bit longer than it should have, but that was the kind of the Q&A session at the end, which I think was worthwhile. I'm going to wave vigorously. Everyone, that was a Rail Natter. I'll see you next week. Cheerio!